everybody, welcome back to another Gideon Stuff adventure video. Real quick, if you hear thunder and wind and all kinds of other horrible things echoing in the background, that's because it is storming really bad right now. I see pieces of my trees falling past the windows right now, so it's going to be a lot of a cleanup in the morning. But what are we doing in today's video? In today's video, we are going to be climbing Big Hatchet Peak. As a lot of you know, I love being outside. I absolutely hate being indoors. I hate being in the city. And so on my days off, one of my favorite things to do is to just go and hike. Go having a little adventure, go camping, go exploring, just do something that gets me outside. And recently I decided that that thing that was going to get me outside was climbing this mountain. Now, as a lot of you also know, I'm a geologist, and when I do my little adventures, I like to make them themed, right? I like to see interesting geologic formations, features, structures, areas of historic interest, things like that. And so the Big Hatchet Mountains were really, really interesting to me because they have an incredible geologic history. And we're going to be getting into all of that. We're going to make this a little bit of an education/adventure video. It's going to be a whole lot of fun. But before I do that, I want to show you guys a little bit of what goes into planning out my little escapades. All right, so I'm sitting down tonight and I'm planning out my next little weekend adventure because I hate being in the city and I got to get out and go adventure and stuff. And something I decided to do was go to the Big Hatchet Mountains in Hidalgo County, New Mexico. There's the Big Hatchet Mountains and Little Hatchet Mountains, the Hatchita Mountains. And the reason I decided to do that was because a few months back, I actually digitized an old geologic map of the area. And I decided, you know what, I want to go down there. I want to hike Big Hatchet Peak. I think it's the tallest peak in Hidalgo County. I was like, you know what, I want to climb that mountain, check that off my list. And we found some really cool stuff. I kind of want to talk about it a little bit. Okay, so here's my adventuring setup right now. I've got two computers open. We'll get to that one here in a second. So here's a geologic map of the area. This little thing here, this is called the U-Bar Ridge. This here, these are the Big Hatchet Mountains. The peak is right around here. Very, very cool. We've got some Cretaceous rocks out there. Actually, I want to go to the Little Hatchet Mountains too, because right here, we've got a geologic map of the Little Hatchet Mountains. See this green formation here? This is a Cretaceous-aged formation where you can find ammonites, which is pretty cool, so I want to run down there and check that out. I do a lot of my research on MnDAT, and so, for example, here, if this will load up again, this tells you a bunch of places of interest. Tells you lithologies, minerals that you can find in the area, which is extensive. Some economic materials, gives you all kinds of info there. And then they also talk about fossils. So here's the list of the fossils. A lot of this stuff is Pleistocene. We've got lots of kind of modern animal forms. These are mostly in the Gila conglomerate, I believe, but if we scroll down here, bam, there's our ammonites, Mormanoceros and Ignoceros from the Upper Cretaceous, so pretty cool. But anyways, so I'm doing my research and my study on this, that, and the other. One of the things I do is I go to Google Earth and I pull up the area that I want to go to, and I look at that. And while I was looking at Google Earth, I saw some pictures from the area, including this picture of a guy who climbed Big Hatchet Mountain and took a picture on the top with 3 hatchets. That is hilarious. I was laughing my ass off. I mean, this took dedication to climb to the top of Big Hatchet Mountain with 3 hatchets for this photo. I love it. I love it. And so then I looked up this guy, and I was looking through all of his photos, and he does a lot of pictures on the tops of mountains with machetes and stuff and different things. I was like, okay, that's kind of interesting. Turns out he's from like the New Mexico area. He does a lot of stuff in New Mexico and California. And I realized that I know this guy we went to school together, and he has a YouTube channel, and I reached out to him. We're going to talk to him a little bit. I will leave a link to his channel if you guys are interested, and if he wants me to do that. But what a small world. I thought that was hilarious that I just so happened to run into a guy that I knew through this. So yeah, that absolutely made my day. So right here, I want to take a minute to plug my friend's YouTube channel. It's called The Desert Polar Bear, which is a fantastic name. That's an incredible name. You guys should definitely go and check him out. Show him some love. He makes really cool videos. They're absolutely gorgeous. He goes to some of my favorite places in the Southwest, and Alex is a peak bagger. I would not consider myself to be a peak bagger. I've bagged quite a few peaks, but when I go on my adventures and stuff, I don't necessarily set out with the intention to climb mountains all the time. He does. That's what he does. Is he goes and he climbs all these peaks in the area. He's done some peaks that make me jealous. I wanna go and have those adventures too. So much cool stuff. Great guy. Definitely check him out. Show him a little bit of love. Tell him Gideon sent you. And yeah, fantastic channel. By the way, I did take a picture at the top of Big Hatchet Peak to try and one-up Alex's picture, but I still think his is way better. All right, so let's go ahead and give a little bit of an introduction to Big Hatchet Peak and the Big Hatchet Mountains. As I mentioned previously, I first became kind of interested in this area because I digitized a geologic map done of the Little Hatchet Mountains. That map was done by William Seeger. Digitizing a Seeger map is no small job. He's an absolutely legendary field geologist who is probably the world's premier geologic mapper of the American Southwest. He is an absolute legend and a beast of a geologist. And when you're digitizing his maps, you're like breathing heavy, like, okay, I know how good this guy is, so I want to make sure I keep every single detail he put in. But anyways, that's what got me interested in the Little Hatchet Mountains. And the Big Hatchet Mountains are bigger, right? Who would have thought? And about a month ago, I was down in the Boot Heel area of New Mexico, and I was looking for agates, and I saw the Big Hatchet Mountains to the south, and they just struck a chord with me. I wanted to go and climb them. Up until just recently, I had not spent a whole lot of time in New Mexico's Boot Heel, which is a real shame because it's gorgeous down there. I absolutely love it. Hidalgo County, Grant County is what makes up the Boot Heel, but down in Animas, Alamo Waco, Hatchita, that whole area, Apache Point, Big Hatchet Mountains, the Little Hatchet Mountains, the Animas Mountains. It's beautiful down there. It's absolutely beautiful, and I love it a whole lot. So, Big Hatchet Mountain is the highest peak in the Big Hatchet Mountain range. The Big Hatchet Mountains are probably, well, they're almost the southernmost mountains of New Mexico. The Alamo Waco Mountains are still a little bit south of them, but they are right on the border between New Mexico and Mexico. On both sides, actually, since it's the Boot Heel, New Mexico sticks down into Chihuahua. I'll throw up a map so you guys can see all that, but very striking mountain. And I'm actually going to read an overview from a site called summitpost.org that I thought actually really beautifully described Hatchet Peak. So here it is. Rising in splendid isolation in a remote corner of New Mexico, Big Hatchet Peak stands as a majestic desert sentinel of the rugged Southwest. This tall and dominating mountain is perhaps the most remote big mountain in the 48 states. Its dark, imposing bulk and distinctive pointed summit can be seen far to the south by passing travelers on Interstate 10. The sheer limestone cliffs of Big Hatchet Peak rise over 4,000 feet above the Playas Valley to the west. It is a very striking mountain. It does leave a deep impression when you first see it, especially like the thing that really stood out to me was while I was on this agate hunting adventure, it was raining and I saw the shadow of this mountain out against the sky. The sun was getting ready to set in the east, or in the west, my bad, and the mountain was to my south, and it was raining a little bit, but also kind of light out, and it was just gorgeous. Despite these attributes, few people visit Big Hatchet Peak. It's located only a few miles from Mexico, and many people probably think it is in Mexico. A lot of people do. The summit of Big Hatchet Peak is surrounded by cliffs on several sides. Access to the area requires a long drive on rough and remote dirt roads. Pretty remote, very remote. The roads were rough, but they weren't terrible. At the summit, climbers can see south into the Sierra Madre Occidental in Mexico, west into the Animas, Pelosio, and Jicarilla Mountains, east into the Sierra Rica in Mexico, and north into the Gila. Yeah, you do get a really nice view up there. The Big Hatchet Mountains are located on BLM land and are part of the greater Big Hatchet Mountains complex. Remote location, low visitor use, and rugged topography ensure that any visitors to this area will be able to enjoy a true wilderness experience. It was very remote, which I love. Get people out of my wilderness. I want to be there by myself. The new field of reduced fire measure has made Big Hatchet Peak an important mountain. Using this criteria, Big Hatchet Peak ranks as the #1 mountain in the state. This makes Big Hatchet Peak perhaps New Mexico's most impressive mountain. So there was a lot of hype going into this, right? A lot of hype, and I was very, very excited to climb this mountain. One thing I do want to interject in here really quickly is a lot of the blog posts that I saw talking about Big Hatchet Peak, and several people that I've talked to in person have complained about being harassed by Border Patrol agents as they're either going into the area or trying to come out. And yeah, they're around, right? We're very close to the border. Janelle and I, we did run into a Border Patrol officer on our way out. We were coming out and the sun was setting. It was getting a little bit late, but we ran into this guy on our way out. He was wonderful. He was a super cool guy. Talked to us a little bit, made sure we weren't up to no good, and let us go. Fantastic dude. Big round of applause, right? Border Patrol agents are people too, right? But yeah, sometimes they can be nasty. I've been harassed by Border Patrol, and I obviously look very American, I feel. But on one instance, I was agate hunting close to the border, and I came off a dirt road that was north of New Mexico 9. New Mexico 9 is a road that goes right along the Mexican border. But I came off this dirt road onto 9, and there happened to be a Border Patrol agent nearby, and he started asking me some questions, and I guess he thought that a single white dude in a pickup truck driving around was kind of suspicious, so he made me get out of the truck, and he gave me the rundown and search and everything like that, which he was kind of rude. It was a little bit, I'm not going to tell the full story, but it was a little bit awkward, but you know, just something to keep in mind, I guess. Now, as for the hike itself, the top of Big Hatchet Peak is at 8,359 feet, and it has about 4,000 feet of prominence. For those of you that don't know, there's two ways to measure a mountain's height. Basically, base of the mountain to the top of the mountain, that's what we call prominence, and then elevation, and that's just how tall the top of the mountain is, how high the top of the mountain is above sea level. So, for example, Mount Everest is the highest spot on Earth because that's the highest point above sea level, but it's not technically the biggest mountain on Earth because there are some mountains that measured base to top are taller than Everest. Mount Denali in Alaska is one, beats it out by just a little bit, but a better example would be like the Hawaiian Islands. Those are the tops of mountains, and they're very, very tall. So as for the trail itself, it's 5.3 miles. You're going to gain about 3,000 feet, about 2,700 feet from the area where we parked. And it's not a rough hike. There's a trail the entire way, so you're not going to be, you know, doing a whole lot of climbing or anything. It's not even all that steep until the very end, and even then it's not anything that's terrible. But as I always say, make sure you have the proper water, food, sunscreen, clothing. Make sure you got a first aid kit. Me and my partner that went and did the climb this time, we had to use the first aid kit and stuff. Just make sure you're taking care of yourself, and you will be fine. We did do this hike in July. The highest temperature that we got on the day we did it was 103, which normally is not, that's temperatures that I'm used to. But sometimes when you mix heat and altitude, it can get, you know, a little bit sticky, but know yourself, know what your limits are, and you should be fine. So let's go ahead and play the footage. All right, so here we are, about to climb Big Hatchet Peak. Right now we're parked up in a little valley to the east of the peak. The roads weren't terrible. Only had to put it into 4 once. The road coming up to this valley there's a couple of bad spots. Took a little bit of a bounce and a hop. But pretty excited about this. About 100 degrees today, but there's a nice little breeze. This valley is just gorgeous. Got my hiking partner, Janelle, out here. We're gonna go ahead and do this shit. So, most of the lithology out here should be limestone, Paleozoic passive margin sediments. Think Pennsylvanian in age, maybe some Mississippian, Carboniferous at any rate. Down towards the bottom of the valley, we've got a lot of tertiary volcanics, got a lot of Pleistocene sedimentary units, some gravels and conglomerates. But up here should be ancient seaways. And we have our Pegomystix robustus. You know, I might be saying that wrong. We're gonna have to look that up. But I don't think this will take us very long. Let's go ahead and get started. That one is bigger. I thought these chert nodules were cow pies at first. They're just like softball-sized chert nodules. So Big Hatchet Mountain is located in Hidalgo County in southern New Mexico, and we're talking southernmost New Mexico. We're down on the boot heel. So we've got Mexico over there and Mexico over there. One of the things that I've heard from people that have done this climb before, the most negative thing is that sometimes you might get harassed by Border Patrol when you're trying to come out of here. Hopefully that doesn't happen to us today. One of us is a little more brown than the other, so that could be problematic. But the Big Hatchet Mountains, there's the Big Hatchet and the Little Hatchet Mountains, are kind of unique because they're a very isolated but high mountain range here in the boot heel. We're in the Basin and Range province, so this high isolated mountain is a result of an uplifted block resulting from crustal extension in this area. Again, most of our lithologies are Paleozoic, and all this is popping up above a lot of tertiary and much younger volcanics. But very interesting spot, great climb. A lot of people like doing this one, and it's beautiful. Man, it's gorgeous in here. Well, we made it. It's beautiful up here. Took us a little longer than we anticipated because I cramped up about halfway up, but luckily Janelle just threw me on her back and piggybacked me all the way up here. For sure. I think it was altitude cramps, which is weird because you're at the top of this mountain, about 300 feet lower than the house I grew up in. And when I was cowboying, we were consistently working at 10,000 feet, but it's been a while since I've done something like this, so feeling all better now, and holy cow, was the view worth it. Isn't that just spectacular? Way over there's Mexico. And that way too, actually. There's limestone all the way up. Oh, that's incredible. Absolutely incredible. Alright, so this is a gear review channel primarily, so what did I carry with me all the way up here? Well, folding knife, Dimco 80-20.5 slicer blade with the Ultim scales. This is kind of my perfect adventure pocket knife. Fixed blade, I'm gonna go let you guys guess. Of course, it's a Cold Steel SRK. What else? Nothing but the best to conquer this mountain. And then I've got a multi-tool in my bag. Loaded with snake shot for the snakes. This is July. Gotta watch out for those. Light arc feld, my titanium pin, and a pencil to sign the little climber's log once you get up to the top. Man, that is something else. Okay, actually I lied. It wasn't quite limestone all the way. See that red patch? We saw some of that on the way up, and at first I thought it might be like granitic plutons intruding the limestone, kind of pushing it up. But then we crossed over an arroyo that had some sandstones that were kind of reddish in there. So I think there's some minor sandstone units out here. I'll have to check the geologic map and just make sure. Focus up. Oh, damn. We survived. What'd you think?
Nice.
If I had to do it over, I probably wouldn't do it in July. But I had a lot of fun. I thought that was pretty good. View from the top is
Except
beautiful.
the fact when I slid down the mountain.
She almost went rolling all the way down. I'll grab her ankle. All right, well, that was pretty fun. I would do it again, not anytime soon. But now I gotta drive us out of here, so fingers crossed that goes well. All right, let's talk a little bit about geology. This is gonna be my favorite part of the video. So throughout the footage that you've seen, you might have heard me use some terms that you're unfamiliar with. Basin and range province, Paleozoic, what have you. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the history of this mountain range because I find it to be very, very interesting. One of the things that excites me the most about geology is tectonics. And this is kind of big picture geology. This is the study of the evolution, development, and changes of Earth's crust. A lot of you might have heard of plate tectonic theory, and this is the idea that Earth's crust is made up of very thin plates of continental and oceanic crust that ride on top of the mantle, which is the middle part of the Earth between the crust and the core, and it's made of a kind of ductile rocks, and it's very hot, and these plates move along its surface, and that's controlled by convection, and the way that these plates interact and break apart and recombine is called tectonics. The rocks of the Big Hatchet Mountains area preserve a lot of really significant and important tectonic events that happened to this part of the country. And we're not going to have time to go into all of them, and it's very, very complicated, so we're not even going to try, but I am going to just briefly touch on some of the more important ones. The oldest rocks in the Big Hatchet Mountains area are Proterozoic, Metamorphic, and Igneous rocks. And these are among the oldest rocks in the American Southwest. These were formed as this part of the North American continent was growing, as it was being added onto or as mountains were being built. And the rocks belong to what is called the Mosetsal orogeny or Mosetsal province. Now this event is poorly understood in a lot of ways, and there's a lot of ongoing research trying to understand everything about what the Mosetsal exactly was. So we're not going to touch on it too much, but I do want to talk about that word I just used, orogeny. This is a word that refers to mountain building events at convergent plate boundaries. When two plates run into each other, one of two things will happen. Either one plate will subduct underneath the other one. This typically happens at continental and oceanic plate boundaries because oceanic crust is denser than continental crust. So it sinks under it and eventually it goes into the mantle and it melts and kind of gets recycled. And when this happens, you've got a lot of magma that's being created. You're erupting volcanoes, you're building volcanic arcs. There's a lot of compression going on, so you're stacking sediments up in that way, and that's a way you can form mountains. The other thing that can happen at a convergent plate boundary is that the two plates have the same density. This happens a lot with continental plates. And instead of one subducting under the other, they just kind of keep pressing and they kind of build themselves up like that. A great example of this is the Himalayas, where India is smashing into the rest of Asia and we're building these massive, massive mountains. So that's what an orogeny is. It's where two plates are running into each other and we're building mountains. So very, very important word to know as a geologist. And those are the rocks that are at the very, very bottom of the Big Hatchet Mountains, are these rocks that are left over from some kind of huge mountain building tectonic event. All right, so moving out of the Proterozoic, we actually have some Cambrian rocks out there at the Big Hatchet Mountains, and we're not going to run through every single rock formation that's out there, but the main lithologies from here on out are going to be sedimentary rocks, limestones, sandstones, shales predominantly. There's going to be some volcanic units. We'll talk about those towards the end. But some of the important formations that are very, very old include the Bliss Formation, which is a sandstone that's Cambrian in age. This is a really, really cool unit that's exposed throughout southern New Mexico and western Texas. This is often associated with the Great Unconformity. This is a spot where we're missing up to 1 billion years in some cases of Earth's history, right? Some rock layers are just gone. And so oftentimes you'll have this Bliss sandstone laying right on top of these ancient Proterozoic rocks. And then that's what we have in this case too. These Proterozoic rocks, the metamorphic and igneous rocks are about 1.65 billion years old. The Bliss Sandstone is about 540 million years old. So we're missing quite a bit of time, and that unconformity can be seen all over the world. It's most famously exposed in the Grand Canyon. When I talk about this with a lot of people, that's where most people know it from, is the Grand Canyon. But it's exposed all over the world. You can see it in multiple different places, but it's really, really cool. So that Bliss Sandstone is Cambrian. And the Cambrian is a really, really important period of geologic time because that's when we see the Cambrian explosion. And what this is a proliferation of biodiversity. Life had been around for quite some time before the Cambrian, but at the Cambrian, we saw a huge jump in evolutionary variety. We see a lot of body forms appear that are still around today, shelled organisms, arthropods, things like that. So it's really, really important, and having exposed out there is really cool. Right on top of the Bliss is the El Paso Formation. This is a really cool formation. This is an Ordovician formation. It's made up of limestones and dolostones, and we've got some other formations like that out there, but these are very, very old sedimentary rocks. And they are some of the first rocks that we see as being passive margin sediments. That's another phrase that I think I mentioned earlier. We're going to go ahead and jump into that. But the best rocks to see that are actually going to be in Pennsylvanian and Permian aged rocks. So there are some Devonian rocks out there. The Purchase Shale is exposed in the Big Hatchet Peaks. And then we have some Mississippian rocks. I think when I was on the hike, I couldn't remember if there were Mississippian or Pennsylvanian rocks at the Big Hatchet Peaks. It turns out there's both. So the Mississippian and the Pennsylvanian together form the Carboniferous. But the Pennsylvanian and Permian aged limestones are what you are going to see most if you do this hike. And honestly, Pennsylvanian and Permian aged limestones are all over southern New Mexico. You go from the Sacramento Mountains, Alamogordo, all the way out down to the Big Hatchet Mountains. A lot of the limestone that you see is Pennsylvanian to Permian in age. So what is limestone? Limestone is a chemical sedimentary rock. Sedimentary rocks come in two kinds, chemical and clastic. A chemical sedimentary rock is formed by minerals that are precipitated out of something, for instance. So if you take like halite, which is salt, if you have salt water and you evaporate it, the water turns to steam and it leaves the salt behind. That's a kind of chemical deposition. In the case of limestone, it's actually biochemical. Limestone is made out of calcium carbonate, and calcium carbonate is an essential ingredient in the shells of many marine organisms, from brachiopods to corals, bryozoans. All kinds of these marine invertebrates use calcium carbonate to construct their exoskeletons, to construct their shells, to hold their bodies together, right? And when these animals die, what happens to that calcium carbonate? Well, it stacks up, it piles up. It forms these, what we call calcareous oozes, which is basically just mud that's full of calcium carbonate. And then when that mud solidifies or lithifies, it becomes limestone. So all the limestone that you see all over New Mexico, came from oceans. And the biggest limestone formation out in the Big Hatchet Peak area is the Orquilla Formation, which is, I think, 3,000 feet thick in places. It's a huge, huge exposure. But these are all from passive margins. All right, let's talk about passive margins. But in order to talk about passive margins, we got to talk about the life cycle of continents. That's right, continents have a life cycle. We call it the Wilson cycle. All of Earth's land masses are constantly moving around, bumping into each other, being ripped apart, recombining. It's a big old mess, but we can trace it using the Wilson cycle. So let's go ahead and just give a kind of brief, simplified overview of what the Wilson cycle is. Let's say we've got a continent, a big chunk of continental crust, a craton, sitting here. And it's happy, it's just chilling, doing its thing, being a continent. But then one day things start to change, and this continent starts to pull apart. It starts to rift. And basically all rifting is the continent is trying to pull itself apart, right? This can be caused by a couple different things, but it's extension. Things are pulling on this continent from two different ends, and it's ripping it apart. As this is happening, you're faulting, and you're starting to get lower elevations, right? So eventually, the ocean is going to flood into this rift. And the rift is going to continue, and continue, and continue, and continue. But you can't rift completely, right? You can't just pull something apart eternally. You can't just rip the entire Earth in half, right? At the middle, at this midpoint between these two pieces of continent that are moving away from each other is what we call a spreading center. And magma starts coming up from underneath the surface, from the mantle, starts welling up and creating new crust. It's creating oceanic crust. So what you have now, what used to be one continent, is split into two continents. One over here, and in between is an ocean, and in the middle of that ocean is a mid-ocean ridge that's forming new crust. And that's growing, and so as that extension keeps going, we're building more crust, building more new oceanic floor. The area that is not tectonically active, that's going to be between our one half of the continent and that mid-ocean ridge. This area in here where there's nothing happening anymore, that's a passive margin. And we call it a passive margin because it's not tectonically active. And so remember, we've got this big ocean in here now between these two continent chunks, and that is where we get a lot of our Pennsylvanian to Permian age, honestly, a lot of our Paleozoic aged fossils in the Southwest United States. These areas were home to huge coral reef systems, and they were populated by bryozoans and crinoids and brachiopods and gastropods and corals, all kinds of these really, really interesting creatures that use calcium carbonate to make their exoskeletons, as well as a lot of other creatures. Your vertebrates, we had ancient sharks swimming around these waters, we had arthropods scuttling around, but we're going to be talking about the invertebrates, the guys that are using the calcium carbonate to make what are now massive sand or limestone formations in the area. Let's talk about coral specifically. So, as Janelle and I were climbing this mountain, Janelle found a fossil of a coral called a rugose coral, or a horned coral. So in my hand right here, I have some fossilized rugose coral from all over the state. We're just going to be using it to talk about Janelle's discovery on that mountain, and there was horned coral everywhere. So rugose coral is actually an extinct variety of coral. These do not exist anymore. And what's kind of unique about these corals is they were solitary. Most corals, like especially nowadays, they form these huge coral reef systems, these big communities of hundreds and hundreds of organisms. But rugose coral, they did not do that. They like to just chill by themselves. And so they're very, very neat. But what's also neat about coral during this time is that there is a whole new type of reef system that doesn't exist on the world or in the world anymore today. That's called an empiric reef. Empiric reefs existed in these areas that were wide, where we're talking hundreds of kilometers across, but were relatively shallow. Coral, like sunny, kind of bright, shallowish water with not a whole lot of clastic sediment. So they don't want a lot of dirt and sand from the continent being dumped in on them. And so back during the Paleozoic, there were these wide expanses on the continental shelf going into the ocean where the temperature and the habit was just right for all these corals and crinoids and things to live. And these reefs would extend for thousands and thousands of kilometers. And that is why we have such extensive limestone exposures today. So I think that's a lot of fun. I think that's really, really cool to think about. And yeah, coral reefs are just awesome. They're fantastic. I love them, and we should keep them around for a while. So those were the predominant rock units that I saw while I was climbing this mountain, was a bunch of these limestones. There was also a lot of faulting out here in the Hatchet Mountains, and that's going to take us into our next set of rocks. The next suite of lithologies that we're going to be talking about are from the Cretaceous. That's quite the jump from the Permian to the Cretaceous. we're skipping over the Triassic and Jurassic completely. This is an unconformity where you're missing rock units. It's called an unconformity. We talked about this a little bit already with the Great Unconformity. There are a couple of unconformities out here in the Big Hatchet Mountains. Great Unconformity, the unconformity between the Permian and the Cretaceous. There's also a couple of unconformities between the Mississippian and Pennsylvanian and a bunch of other rock units. It happens. It can happen for a couple of reasons. One reason is because no rocks were deposited. So you're not really missing anything so much as nothing was ever laid down. It's very, very unlikely that nothing was deposited between the Permian and the Cretaceous. In fact, Jurassic-aged rocks have been found in the area. So the second reason that unconformities may occur is that the rocks were eroded away. And this can happen because they were eroded after being deposited, or they were exposed and eroded, or there was some faulting that happened, and when the units got faulted out, was eroded in that way. There's a lot of different ways that you can end up with missing units. Now, the Cretaceous brings us to some very interesting topics in this area. The main Cretaceous formations in the Big Hatchet Mountain area are the U-Bar formation, the Hell to Finish formation, and the Mollado formation. That was a big gust of wind. And these are all very, very cool. And in this area, there have been ammonite fossils, plant fossils, hadrosaur fossils, tyrannosaur fossils found in these units. Most of that is in the Little Hatchet Mountains, but these units are present in the Big Hatchet Mountains. Now, what's really, really cool about Cretaceous New Mexico is it is the last time where New Mexico was underwater. During the Triassic and Jurassic, most of New Mexico was completely terrestrial, but about the middle of the Cretaceous, what's called the Western Interior Seaway kind of cut North America in half, and what is now eastern New Mexico was underwater for millions and millions of years, and at certain parts, most of New Mexico was underwater. But the ocean retreated. And why did that happen? Well, it's because the land started to rise up. It started to gain elevation. Mountains were building and rising above the sea. Why did that happen? The Laramide orogeny. And this is one of the most important tectonic events that's ever happened in North America. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about this. The Laramide orogeny started about 75 million years ago, and it ended about 45 million years ago, give or take. So it started in the Cretaceous and it ended sometime in the Oligocene, right? It was preceded by the Sevier orogeny, which is probably responsible for some of the deformation that we see out in the Big Hatchet Mountains, but we're not going to get into distinguishing Sevier from Laramide orogeny right now. But basically what happened was a tectonic plate on the west coast completely subducted underneath North America. This is called the Farallon plate. And this plate, instead of subducting and going back into the mantle, it subducted at a low angle and it kind of coasted underneath the continent. And so you can imagine if this is North America, we have this plate that's going under it, it's pushing up mountains. And we see a lot of that deformation in rocks in New Mexico today. In fact, throughout the entire American West. Faulting and folding really at the Big Hatchet Mountains is kind of hard to see. When I was doing the hike, I did see some conglomerates, some like fault breccia looking stuff that was pretty indicative of faulting. I did see some minor folding in some of the limestones and stuff, but a lot of it's not super well exposed. There is a little spot called the Hatchet Gap where you can find a couple hundred feet of an exposed fault. But a lot of these faults are kind of poorly exposed, and it kind of makes studying them a little bit difficult. But a lot of the deformation that we can trace back to some of these units inevitably came from the Laramide for sure. All right, tailing right off the end of the Laramide, we're going to start talking about the Basin and Range Province. And the Rio Grande Rift. So the Rio Grande Rift, I mentioned before on the channel, it's an area of crustal extension that goes from southern Colorado down into Chihuahua. And it's a part where North America is trying to rip in half, right? We talked a little bit about rifts. This is the first stage of that Wilson cycle where you're tearing a continent apart. Now, the Rio Grande Rift may be a failed rift. It's probably not going to split North America all the way in half, right? North America is pretty big right now. Give it, you know, a long, long time and nothing else happening tectonically. Maybe eventually it could tear North America apart, but the rift has slowed considerably, and it's probably not going to tear North America apart. But what you do get with this rift system is a lot of faulting. You're dropping these blocks down, you're faulting stuff, and you're forming these systems called Horst and Graben systems. Basically what these are is you'll drop a block down in relation to another block, and you'll drop a block down on the other side of that, and that can kind of force that middle part up. And that is what we call our Horsts. And the basins are called the Grabens. What you also get with a rift system is a lot of volcanism. Remember, you're thinning the crust, you're bringing the mantle closer to the surface, you have a lot of volcanic eruptions. And in the Big Hatchet Mountains area, you have a lot of tertiary volcanics. Not really on the mountains themselves, but out in the surrounding basins, there's lots of andesites and rhyolites that have been erupted during some of these volcanic events. Now, the Big Hatchet Mountains are not part of the Rio Grande Rift, right? They're pretty far away. They're on the western margin of it, but they are related in tectonic deformation style. They are part of the Basin and Range Province, and this is a big area of North America that goes from about Washington, Oregon area down into Mexico and over to West Texas a little bit. Depending on who you ask, the lines can be drawn a little bit differently, but it's an area of crustal extension as well, where we're seeing a lot of these Horst and Graben systems where we're dropping down these basins and we're rising up these mountains. And that's where it gets its name, basins and ranges. The ranges are the mountains and the basins are the basins, right? And that's what uplifted Big Hatchet Mountain. So basin and range extension started probably about 20 million years ago, and it's probably related in some way to that Farallon plate that we talked about that kind of glided under North America. That plate eventually stopped going, and it might have broken off and fallen into the mantle, or a piece of it could have broken and done what's called slab rollback, and this can get kind of complicated. We're not going to get into the geophysics of this, but basically underneath you had this thing kind of stop moving, a piece of it broke, and when you had this piece kind of fold down and the rest of it fell into the mantle, you created space for some extension, moving magma around, things like that. And that's what might be responsible for this basin and range topography. And it's very, very cool. The basin and range topography, if you look at it from like Google Earth, it's very, very recognizable. You have these ranges and these basins. And that is how we got this Big Hatchet Peak. It's an isolated mountain, but it's part of one of these systems where we're dropping down these basins and we're raising up these ridges. And in this case, we're raising up a bunch of Paleozoic and Cretaceous sedimentary rocks way, way high. The top of Big Hatchet Peak is what's called a rain island. And we see these in the Chihuahuan Desert where you have these very, very high peaks above the valley floor. The peaks get most of the rain. Not a whole lot of rain makes it down to the bottom. But what you end up with are these just ecosystems at the top of the mountains that are completely different from anything on the ground, completely different from any peaks around, honestly, too. A lot of these, they're called islands because they're kind of isolated. You might have a mountain range, or you might have a couple big sky island mountains that are, let's say, 40 miles away from each other, but the tops of these mountains have very, very different floral and faunal assemblages because it's hard to travel between the tops of these mountains, right? And so very, very cool ecology. So there's a really quick rundown on some of the science behind the Big Hatchet Peaks. Again, this is just kind of Cliff Notes version, but I think it was a lot of fun. And I'm gonna go ahead and end this video right here. It's probably been long enough. Before you guys go, do not forget to check out the Desert Polar Bear YouTube channel. Alex does a lot of really cool stuff over there. Definitely worth checking in with that. Big shout out to my channel members right here. Thank you guys for everything you do for the channel. I really appreciate it. You guys saw the Dimco Ultim 20.5 in this video. We are going to be having a couple other videos featuring that knife coming out soon. A review and also some customization. So keep an eye out for that. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, leave it a like, comment below, and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one. Adios.